Welcome to Billy's Books. It's been a while. Nice to be back. Today I'm not doing a history book, and I'm not doing a sci-fi book, unless you consider music autobiographies to be history, which I do. To Remain in Love by Chris Frantz of the Talking Heads. Chris Frantz loves Tina Weymouth. That is transcendent, the most important message throughout all of this, and God bless them both. Chris also realizes that many other people love Tina, but he is not jealous. He just says that just shows that they have good taste. He's not jealous or possessive or anything because he's too cool for that. He's also just a really nice guy in general. He's been told by several rock stars, "You're too nice to be a rock star." I think that's funny. So anyway, he is born of a handsome military man, and he describes his mom as a knockout Southern belle. He describes some early memories. His mammy, which is a nickname for his grandmother, told me that I come, meaning I, Chris, I come from a good family, so I don't have to kowtow to anyone. He also talks fondly about his grandfather when he was a little kid. I'm going to give you a little paragraph just shows how nice his grandfather was. After school, I would try to convert my radio flyer wagon into an airplane using the driveway as a runway. When my wagon failed to fly, I remember asking Pappy to help me lift my wagon up a ladder to the roof of the house so that I could take off from there. Instead of saying no, he told me I would need to get a pilot's license first. I get the feeling it's just that the parents were a little bit concerned with class. So for example, his mom, whom he adored, when he was a kid, he really liked Elvis Presley, as many kids do, and his mom was like, "Oh, Chris, he's so common." He also tells lots of other random childhood memories. He talks about weird pre-sexual encounters, which I will not go into detail. I'll let you read that yourself. Crashing a bike. He was used to little pedal bikes, and then suddenly someone lent him their 10-speed. Of course, that has hand brakes instead of pedal brakes, so that he crashed right into a wall, and he remembers that very well. He had some crazy friends. His mom's had some crazy friends. They're very forgiving. He was very forgiving of a dog that killed his pet bunny. So that just tells how nice Chris is. He had crushes on various kids in school. He got to a new school, and there was a hot blonde and a cool French brunette. And the first day they kind of smiled at him and said, "See you in band practice," which of course, being musically inclined, he was drawn to. He also jumps forward later on. I'm just going in how I read it. Notes I took down as I read it. So even though he's not young anymore, he suddenly jumps way ahead to the noughties and talks about seeing Smile at Carnegie Hall, and it brought him to tears. Smile being Brian Wilson's masterpiece that he was originally started in the 60s and abandoned because he lost his marbles, and the Beach Boys didn't back him up near the record company. So in his revival, around late 90s and early noughties, Brian Wilson got his band back together, and with a lot of help, he finished Smile. It is indeed a masterpiece. So now there's two official versions. There's the Beach Boys Smile, which is those sessions compiled in an interesting way, and then also the Brian Wilson Smile, which is the truly completed project with his new band doing their darndest to sound like the Beach Boys, and probably with superior musicianship. The important point is, I was also at that concert. I also got to see Brian Wilson play Smile at Carnegie Hall, and it was indeed one of the most fantastic experiences I ever had. I think there's a DVD of that tour. I don't think it's at Carnegie Hall, but whew, what a good thing. And of course the Brian Wilson Smile album is also unquestionably awesome. At some point early on, Talking Heads opened up for Dylan. So I'm going to read you a little snippet from that just to show some of the life in showbiz life. Years later, in 1990, after Roy Orbison died, Roy's widow, Barbara, asked us to play a fundraiser at the Universal Amphitheater in Burbank, California, to help to build a homeless shelter in Roy's name. Tina, Jerry, and I accepted her invitation with pleasure, performed Sweet Dream Baby as the Shrunken Heads. The headliner was Bob Dylan with the original Reunited Birds. While we were watching their set from the green room in a video monitor, Bob's big security men came in and said, "Everybody out! Bob's coming in and doesn't want to see anybody." Emmylou Harris, Bonnie Raitt, Wendy and Lisa, Iggy Pop, Patrick Swayze, and a host of other musicians, including Tina and Jerry, Tina Weymouth and Jerry Harrison, got up and left the room. I decided to stay. I wanted to meet Bob. Because I was wearing a blue blazer, I think Bob's people thought I worked there and didn't shoo me out. When Bob strolled in, he asked me casually, "Hey man, where'd everybody go?" I told him his people had kicked everybody out, and Bob said, "Oh shit, even Emmy Lou?" "Yes," I said, "even Emmy Lou." Now, I mentioned before about he loves Tina Weymouth. Well, he met her in art school. I'll just read two or three paragraphs. This is great. One of my friends, an effete and smart young guy named Gregor, and I were setting up our easels at one end of the studio when I noticed Martina, who was wearing a khaki navy Flyers jumpsuit, was setting up at the other end of the room, closer to the female model. We were in modeling class, obviously, model drawing class. The model was sitting in a tableau of brightly colored fabrics and cafe furniture, bottles, and glasses that Merkin had set up for us to paint. As our teacher prowled the room, offering advice and encouragement, I didn't want to stare, but all I could think about was this new girl. How should I introduce myself? What could I possibly say to her? Should I play it cool or come on strong? I didn't know what to do, but then an opportunity presented itself. At the end of the class, Gregor sauntered over to her, took one look at the painting she was working on, and said, "Obviously you have no idea what you're doing." I didn't know what he was thinking or why he would say such a thing, but she looked crestfallen. Here's my chance. I walked over to this beautiful girl and said, "I'm sorry about my friend's bad manners. Obviously, he has no idea what he's doing." She smiled at me with a sense of relief and laughed. "I like this class," she said. I told her I did too. I said, "My name is Chris. It's really good to meet you." As she cleaned up her painter's palette and packed up her paints, she turned to me, looked at me with her bright blue eyes, and said, "It's nice to meet you. My name is Tina." The rest is history. The rest is more notes. Alrighty, so turns out Chris already has a girlfriend. Later on, they were all a group of friends and stuff, and somehow they ended up at the same table. Chris's girlfriend, and Tina, and a few other people. Well, he started talking to Tina real quick, and they found they had a lot in common. They both came from military families, blah, 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 blah. And everyone noticed they were talking a lot, including Chris's current girlfriend. And so when everybody left and it was just the two of them, the existing girlfriend was like, "I'll bet she's not even a real blonde." Now we're going to jump to New York City. I was able to really see a lot of the things he's talking about because in my 20s I hung out with a lot of friends and played music in the Lower East Side in that same area. There's a place called the Bowery, which is sort of downtown, east part of Manhattan, obviously, sort of around Houston on the east side and everything like that. That's where the very, very famous CBGB's is, and we're going to hear more about that. So, but in the mid-'70s, or early to mid-'70s, it was even crappier than it was when I was there. You could go around and there'd be bums everywhere, people shooting up drugs, and corpses you'd have to step over. That's the Bowery for you. Hey! So who were there? Who was hanging out there? Just a little bit of name dropping for you. The scene there included Ornette Coleman, who had a studio, Willem Dafoe, Mark Rothko, a very baked Mick Jagger once. He almost walked up to him, but Mick was so messed up that he decided to wait to introduce himself at some later point. At CBGB's, he saw the Ramones before they were famous, and like a lot of these people, they were not famous yet who played at CBGB's. And the Ramones would argue about the songs they were playing and tell each other how they screwed up on stage, which I think is pretty funny. He also, as a good little quote here, also Blondie was there, Patti Smith, people like that. Blondie wasn't Blondie yet. Debbie Harry was fronting a different band at that time. He says about that scene, "Debbie and Tina were like roses in a rattlesnake's nest." So eventually, for a while, it was just Chris and David. But Chris kept on saying, "We got to get you in the band. Maybe you should play bass or something." She's like, "I'm not a musician." But Chris knew she's got the beat. She's got the beat from her dancing and just generally knowing her very well. So eventually, she saved up some money, and without telling anybody, she bought a bass, and they started playing. So once she got a bass, soon they were a trio, right? They had guitar, bass, and drums. That's enough for a band. They decided that they had that cool name, Talking Heads, based on, people's faces on television. That was the original idea. Not the Talking Heads, just Talking Heads. So they went to the CBGBs, which they hung out at all the time and met people all the time. They liked the scene, and it was warm, not warm, but friendly to cool people, or anybody really who bothered to go there, because it was a shithole. And they went to the owner and said, we'd like to audition. And he was like, I like you guys, sure. We'll have you open up the Ramones on Thursday night. You're not going to get paid. If it goes well, you can open for the Ramones the subsequent Friday night, and you can work out the Ramones the money and stuff. So they play on Thursday night to a relatively empty room, because it's Thursday night and nobody gave a crap. And afterwards, Johnny Ramone said, yeah, they suck, so they can open for us. They'll make us look good. Other first encounters with famous people was when they were finally introduced to Patti Smith, who they all looked up to. Patti Smith said, oh yeah, you're that art school band. I wish my parents had enough money to send me to art school. And she turned her back on them and kept talking to the other person. End of interview. So, even though they were just a trio, they were starting to get record offers. They got a record offer by Sire Records and also Columbia, but they turned them down because they knew they weren't ready. How about that, huh? They knew they needed a fourth person. They didn't have it yet, and they knew they weren't tight yet. So they kept going. They kept on playing downtown at CBGB's and a few other places in the area. At one point, Lou Reed came to check them out, and he really liked them, and he invited them back to his apartment. So that very night of that gig, like at 2 in the morning, they went to Lou's apartment, and he thought, Chris thinks it's pretty funny because Lou lived in the fancy schmancy Upper East Side, which is right next to Bloomingdale's or something. He thought that was very funny, that Lou Reed would be right at Bloomingdale's. And they got there, and the three of them sat on his one couch, and Lou Reed sat on the floor and just ate. He got a big thing of Haagen-Dazs, and a pint of Haagen-Dazs, and sat there talking to them. And he got there, and he's like, oh, this is going to need a spoon. So Tina was like, oh, I'll go get it. She goes to the fridge. She goes to the kitchen, and there's one bent, blackened, burned spoon. She goes, here you go, and brings it back to him, and he eats the entire tub of ice cream himself in front of them. But the important thing is that he critiques their set, and he's like, oh, you guys are good this way. He tells David Byrne he should wear long sleeve shirts because his arms are too hairy. And he's like, there's this one song I really like. You should play it fast. You play it too fast. You should play it slower. They slowed it down a little bit, but not as much as he probably wanted because their up-tempo numbers were more successful. He also said, I like you guys so much. I'd like to produce you, get you signed and produce you. So he sent them to his manager the next few days, and they went down and met the manager, and he's like, yeah, sure, here's your contract, look it over and get back to me. So they had to find they had to find a lawyer, and the lawyer was like, oh yes, this is a typical record contract, a standard contract. It's very exploitative. You'll get all the hits, they'll get all the money, you won't get crap. There's so many R&B stars out there now who have tons of hits that you love, and they're still dirt poor. Don't do it. Don't take this contract. So they decided, well, that was very nice of Lou Reed, but we're not going to do that. They were still a trio, by the way, so they had to still find their fourth member, which I'll get to in a second. But first, another famous person came to see them. Someone told Andy Warhol to go down there. And of course, they were totally excited about that because they were from RISD and they worshipped Andy Warhol. And he got there, and his response was, oh, they're so cute. Do you think they'd like to have lunch? And he invites them to lunch, and they have a nice meeting, and it's all very cool and well documented. There are pictures, lots of pictures in the book, which are cool, very interesting. So they eventually, someone connected them to Jerry Harrison, who had been in the Modern Lovers, which had recently broken up, which broke his heart. They had broken up in the middle of recording an album. A lot of bands break up just as they get famous, and this is one of those. And Jerry Harrison had given up music and was going to go, I forgot, study architecture or something. I forgot what it was, but he had moved to Boston. So they had driven all the way. So they drew from New York City. They booked a gig in Boston just for his sake, even though nobody knew them in Boston. He was like, well, consider this just an opportunity for us to audition for you. So they went to this place that was not very friendly to them. The crowd was polite but small and didn't care because they were more into mainstream stuff, and they were weird. And while they were playing, he noticed, oh yeah, there's Jerry in the back. He's in the corner there, just kind of, he wasn't smiling or anything, but afterwards he talked, and he was like, well, I'm not convinced, but, you know, let's talk some more. So what it came down to was Jerry Harrison eventually did join, obviously. He was originally hired as a keyboard player, but then, it turns out he's also a very good guitar player. So he got to switch back and forth, really expanding their sound, making them much cooler. And but one of the things he said was, I guess probably as a result of being burnt by the Modern Lovers experience, he's like, I'm not going to officially join your band until you get a record contract. And they were like, fair is fair, that's cool, because he was out front about it, and I assume they got along with him personally. Meanwhile, David Byrne is a little ambitious. So David Byrne, by 1976, he's already trying to push Tina out. They're doing a show. Before the show starts, David goes up to the sound guy and says, I'm thinking of kicking Tina out and getting a proper bass player. What do you think? Of course, the sound guy's like, I don't know what to do about that, and doesn't say a word. And then I guess Chris walks back into the room, and David, change the subject. You can even see in Stop Making Sense that there's two bass players. So he eventually, in his ambitious ways, got the bass player he wanted, but he still wasn't able to boot her out. She is known for saying things like, David does not know how to return friendship. Later on, or not much further along that, still before they were signed, David came up to Chris and said, I've been talking to a lawyer, and he was talking about songwriting publishing, and songwriting publishing is kind of, mostly based on lyrics. And by the way, I'd like to do most of the lyrics. So Chris was like, okay, that's cool. I mean, you're good at lyrics and stuff. I support that, without fully realizing that, I guess, at the time, being such a nice guy and trusting whatever the consequences of that in the long term. Chris talks about when the Tom Tom Club got their first gold record or whatever, they were all in a limo together, the three of them at least, in the back seat. And someone said, congratulations, Chris and Tina, you got your first gold record with Tom Tom Club. And instead of congratulating them or anything like that, he says, David just turned his head to the window and got really quiet and looked out. Chris says that is an example of David's sort of ambition at the expense of his collaborators. But Chris being so nice, he's like, but I don't want you to get the wrong idea about David. Anybody who knows him is not jealous of his success. Which is an interesting quote. Anyway, this is where I'm going to stop. As usual, I stop my review before the end of the book, so I don't give away the ending or anything like that. But I'm really enjoying it. I recommend it highly. Remain in Love by Chris Frantz. I got it from my library. Support your local library. What you can't do, review.